Hey everybody, this is chapter 7 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. Chapter 7 is titled Mechanism. Having depicted the struggle between the two philosophical movements of mechanism and Deborahnism and their supersession by Tertius Gaudens, we must now look more closely at their respective doctrinal contents. As we have seen, De Boron thought to gain an advantage in his struggle with mechanism by representing mechanism as the theoretical basis of that rightist deviationism against which the party, under Stalin's direction, was already carrying on an energetic campaign. De Boron therefore endeavored to couple his philosophical hostility towards mechanism with the party's political struggle against, quote, rightist deviationism, end quote. The expected success eluded him. De Boron had improvidently overlooked the fact that the party was waging war not only against rightist deviation, but also against Trotskyism, whose position was referred to as, quote, leftist deviationism, and that hence it was possible for a given philosophical tendency to be linked with this other aberration as its philosophical basis. De Boron had thereby himself delivered the weapon into the hands of his opponents. Mitten, astutely making use of the conflict between De Boron and the mechanists, described mechanism as the philosophical basis of rightist deviationism, and De Boron's, quote, Menshevizing idealism, end quote, as the corresponding foundation of leftist deviation, since the party was waging war, quote, on two fronts, end quote, against both aberrations. He set himself accordingly to waging a two-front war in philosophy against both mechanism and Menshevizing idealism. But though mechanism may be described as the theoretical foundation of rightist deviation, and Menshevizing idealism that of the left, this is not to be regarded as an exclusive alternative. Mitten himself gives warning of this, as though rightist deviation could only imply mechanism, the leftist only idealism, without admixture of mechanism. Trotsky, for example, which in politics ranks as a leftist deviation, is, quote, steep through and through, end quote, from the philosophical point of view, quote, with the commonest and most vulgar form of mechanism, end quote. Mitten, M.B. Mitten. For contemporary Soviet philosophy, however, the essentials of a philosophical theory are only reckoned to have been grasped when its social and political roots have been exposed. Hence, it was also incumbent on Mitten to point to the social origins of both aberrations. These, he considers, may be ascribed to the fact that even after the victory of the proletariat and the establishment of the proletariat's dictatorship, many bourgeois views and habits had survived among the people without being given up immediately. Moreover, the proletariat in its struggle for the revolution had been joined by numerous elements stemming from the bourgeoisie who had not yet been able to emancipate themselves from their old opinions and attitudes. All this was bound sooner or later to lead to differences of opinion and deviations to right or left. These two aberrations, therefore, give expression to the modes of thought of petty bourgeois elements, with this difference, however, that the rightist deviation primarily exhibits the mentality of the bourgeois peasantry, kulaki, whereas the leftist outlook is that of the ruined capitalist class, the petty bourgeois city dweller. New section. Section 1. General character of mechanism. The primary characteristic of mechanism is its fundamentally hostile attitude towards philosophy, which, as in Mitten's case, it often denies any title to existence. Hence, the mechanists stand accused in contemporary dialectical materialism of a certain, quote, positivism, inasmuch as the mechanists deny the right to existence of any special discipline of philosophy. Sorry, one second. Come on. Fucking computer. Come on, man. Where the hell am I? As a special, hence the mechanists stand accused in contemporary dialectical materialism of a certain, quote, positivism, inasmuch as they deny the right to existence of any special discipline of philosophy over and above the positive sciences, and refuse to recognize the dialectic, i.e. philosophy, as a special science alongside the positive sciences. Stepanov's formula to this effect has become famous. Quote, the Marxists recognize no special field of, quote, philosophical activity, end quote, distinct from that of science. For the Marxist, materialist philosophy consists in the latest and most general findings of modern science, end quote. I. Stepanov in the book Historical Materialism and Modern Natural Sciences, 1927. Quote, does dialectic exist as a science on its own account, or is dialectic merely a method, end quote? So the mechanists ask, and answer the question to the disadvantage of dialectic. To profess to see in dialectic anything more than a method, to speak of the dialectic as present in reality in nature itself, to conceive of it as an independent science alongside the positive sciences, would amount in their view to scholasticism, logistic, or even, quote, mysticism. Quote, science is itself philosophy, end quote, according to the mechanists, and in so saying they follow Menin's example. In the positivism of theirs, they come close to the position of certain theorists of the Second International, such as Adler, for whom Marxism is nothing else but a positive science, with no attached philosophy of its own, or Bannstein or Forländer, and in Russia, Struve, whose view is that Marxism can be combined with any desired philosophy, in their case, for example, with Neo-Kantianism. As against this mechanistic, quote, positivism, Mitten, the champion of Leninist orthodoxy, has pointed with some justice to the untenability of a position which seeks to deny philosophy any right to existence. No science is possible without a philosophical foundation. Every science must render an account of that which it investigates, whether it be a world independent of thought, or itself a product of thinking. Moreover, there can be no such thing as a positive science without a general theory of scientific thought, or a grounding and establishment of its principles. For without thought, it is impossible even to connect two facts of positive experience, one with another, let alone to discover the permanent laws operative in nature and society. No science can dispense with a clear answer to the question as to whether the world is knowable. In confirmation of his view, Mitten cites a passage from Engels, drawn not surprisingly from the Dialectics of Nature, his maturest philosophical work, whereas elsewhere, for instance, at one point in the Anteduring, he inclines towards a form of positivism. Quote, natural scientists believe that they free themselves from philosophy by ignoring philosophy or abusing philosophy. They cannot, however, make any headway without thought, and for thought they need thought determinations. ... Hence they are no less in bondage to philosophy, but unfortunately in most cases to the worst philosophy, and those who abuse philosophy most are slaves to precisely the worst vulgarized relics of the worst philosophies. End quote. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. In like fashion, Mitten also invokes the authority of Lenin on his behalf, appealing to that thesis, quote, which is binding on any party member who concerns himself with the study of natural science, end quote. Quote, unless it stands on a solid philosophical ground, no natural science and no materialism can hold its own in the struggle against the onslaught of bourgeois ideas and the restoration of the bourgeois outlook. In order to hold its own in this struggle and to carry it to a victorious finish, the natural scientist must be a modern materialist, a conscious adherent of the materialism which is represented by Marx, i.e. he must be a dialectical materialist. End quote. A further difference between dialectical materialism and mechanism lies in the mechanist conception of dialectic. They attribute all motion to impulses arising from without, and thereby abandon that attribute of matter which the dialectical materialists regard as most essential, namely its inner liveliness, that spontaneity which they describe in their Hegelian terminology as the, quote, self-movement of matter. As we know already, dialectical materialism explains the origin of motion by means of the, quote, law of the unity of opposites, the chief law of the dialectic, owing to the presence of internal contradictions, contradictions whose tendency is to break apart from one another. A thing, a phenomenon, a process is set in motion from within. According to the mechanist view, on the other hand, the origin of motion is ascribed to external impulses outside the thing, lest they should be compelled, therefore, to acknowledge a first mover. The mechanists, like the old French materialists of the 18th century, conceive of nature as eternal and unchangeable. As already indicated above, the mechanists see something mystical, teleological in the notion of dialectic. Bukharin accused Marx and Engels of having bequeathed to the proletariat a world outlook by no means free from, quote, a certain teleological flavor, which inevitably clings to the Hegelian formula, which speaks of a self-development on the part of, quote, spirit, end quote. Bukharin. In spite of this, the mechanists themselves make use of the term, quote, dialectic, though interpreting it in their own mechanistic fashion. Bukharin proposes, in place of the, quote, mystificatory dialectic, to found Marxism on the, quote, theory of equilibrium, which, quote, would constitute a more general formulation, purged of idealist elements, of the laws governing material systems in motion, end quote. Bukharin. More will be heard of this equilibrium theory in dealing with Bukharin, its principal exponent. One outcome of this basic conception is the denial of quality and of the emergence of new qualities. The mechanists taught that phenomena of a higher order are attributable to those of lower order, and hence that everything can be explained by means of mechanical laws. Thus, Stepanov maintains that all phenomena in the universe can be traced back to simple physical and chemical processes. Quote, to gain understanding of any organic phenomenon means, for modern science, to trace it back to relatively simple chemical and physical processes, end quote. Stepanov. Stepanov seeks, therefore, to reduce physiology to physics and chemistry, and organic processes to physical and chemical processes of a highly complicated kind. By the same token, even mental activity is to be traced back to physical and chemical processes. Stepanov was not alone in these assertions. Stepanov simply gave expression to a current mode of thought which was held in high regard even in so important an institution as the Moscow State Institute for Scientific Research, which bore the name of Timiryazev, the celebrated scientist. The publications of the institute elaborated ideas akin to those of Stepanov. It was held that not only physical activities but even phenomena of the social order could be derived from physico-chemical processes. Quote, in theory and in fact, social phenomena may equally well be subjected either to qualitative sociological investigation or to quantitative analysis on chemical, physical, and biological lines, end quote. In their enterprise of deriving everything from simpler and ultimately from mechanical phenomena, the protagonists of the school relied on the works of I.P. Pavlov, who lived from 1849 to 1936, the celebrated Russian physiologist and professor at the University of St. Petersburg. Footnote. Although Pavlov considered a mechanistic explanation to be the ideal aim of scientific research, he continued to be held in high regard even among the dialectical materialists, as may be seen from the warm tribute paid to him after his death by A.M. de Borin. De Borin regards Pavlov's attempt to provide a physiological explanation for mental phenomena as of great service to materialism generally, even though one may still have doubts about what Pavlov calls the, quote, mechanistic ideal of scientific research, end quote. Pavlov himself, in a speech delivered in 1931, described his outlook in the following terms, quote, I am neither a materialist nor an idealist. I am a monist, or if one must commit oneself, a methodological materialist, end quote. Pavlov. End footnote. The latter Pavlov distinguishes between conditioned and unconditioned reflexes. Unconditioned or stable reflexes are those whose operation is immediately evoked by the stimulus. Thus, food entering a dog's mouth induces salivation. Reflexes are conditioned when their operation results not immediately from the stimulus, but from the phenomena which accompany it. Thus, food enters a dog's mouth, and at the same time a bell is sounded, and when this is done repeatedly, salivation is evoked by the mere sound of the bell. The mechanist saw in these conditioned reflexes the basis of association and thought. Every type of spiritual expression up to and including the highest forms of cultural creativity, science, art, philosophy, and religion was thought of as a mere product of physiological automatisms. This theory was also applied to the phenomena of social life. In the social and political field, mechanism brought forward the theory of spontaneity. The latter represents a radical economic determinism according to which socialism will come about automatically, spontaneously by natural necessity, in the course of the social and politico-agrarian development of the national economy. In consequence of the socialization process in the towns, industrialization, without the intervention of the collective class will, without class warfare in the countryside, without an active struggle for the collectivization of the economy, and the introduction of the kolkhoz system, the class war and dictatorship of the proletariat thereby lose their significance. In this respect, the mechanists take their stand on the determinism of the early Russian Marxists with their economic materialism, and of the economists with their conception of stikhanost. In the mechanistic theory of Samotek, we may see the precise reason why mechanism finds no acceptance in Leninist Bolshevism. The mechanist thesis, which admits only of quantitative changes, leads to the denial of development by leaps and maintains that all such development is continuous. Evolution proceeds steadily and not in jerks. Mechanism therefore implies the elimination of class contradictions and avoidance of the class struggle. Bukharin, the leading exponent of mechanism, was in fact accused of cherishing the hope that the larger peasants would move peacefully over to socialism. Mechanism thereby set itself in direct opposition to the official Soviet theory, which was concerned to emphasize the class struggle and the necessity of a central party organization to carry it through. In addition, authors reckoned as mechanists by the official philosophy themselves differed considerably in opinion one from another. Mitten himself acknowledges that it is not easy to bring them all in under one and the same title, since, quote, the mechanists of today represent an unprincipled coalition of revisionist groups, end quote. The mechanists include both the vulgar materialists of the early years of the Soviet regime, such as Minin and Enchman, and the natural scientists such as Timiryazev, and others of whom mention has already been made. Among the mechanist philosophers, the most prominent is Bukharin, who applied the philosophy of Bogdanov to historical materialism and political economy, and endeavored to supplant the materialist dialectic by his well-known, quote, theory of equilibrium, unquote. Finally, there are various other philosophers who are reckoned as mechanists, such as Axelrod and Sarabyanov, of whom the latter, however, is more of a positivist or subjective idealist, and Variash, who ranks as a disciple of Freud. All of them stand accused, according to the official philosophy, of seeking a revisionism of the fundamentals of dialectical materialism. New section, Section 2, Bukharin. The most notable of the theorists of mechanism is Nikolai Ivanovich Bukharin, who lived from 1888 to 1937. The son of a municipal teacher in Moscow, he abandoned religion in early youth. While attending high school, he felt deep sympathy for a time with the nihilism of Pisarev and joined the Revolutionary Organization for Students in 1905. Having matriculated at Moscow University, entered the Russian Social Democratic Party in 1906 and became a convinced Bolshevik revolutionary. Many times arrested, Bukharin was eventually exiled to Onega in 1910, but he succeeded in escaping to Western Europe, where he established contact with Lenin. His literary activities began about this time. He wrote a series of articles against the exponents of Marxist criticism and the, quote, legal Marxist, Struve, Tubingen, Baranovsky, which later appeared in collected form under the title Attack. In the winter of 1912/13, Bukharin attended Bumbaverk's lectures on political economy in Vienna and worked on his book The Economic Theory of the Leisure Class, which is considered in Marxist circles to be the best refutation of Bumbaverk, the leader of, quote, the Austrian school. After the outbreak of World War, Bukharin was arrested by the Austrian police as a suspected spy and later expelled to Switzerland. In Switzerland, Bukharin joined the Bolsheviks in campaigning against those Marxists who supported the war under the pretext of, quote, defending the fatherland, end quote. At the same time, he wrote a new and larger work titled Imperialism and World Economy. From Switzerland, Bukharin emigrated to Sweden. Driven out from there, also, Bukharin moved to Norway and eventually arrived illegally in America. After the February Revolution of 1917, Bukharin traveled via Japan and Siberia to Moscow and became a leading figure in the Bolshevik movement. From December 1917 onwards, he was editor of Pravda, but resigned this position in 1918, having fallen out with Lenin over the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. I have a book in this channel about the left communists in the Bolshevik Party in the early revolutionary period, and Bukharin being a central figure in that. Bukharin, in fact, was in favor of continuing the war against Germany. At that time, Bukharin was at the head of a group of left-wing communists, but soon afterward, Bukharin acknowledged his conduct in this period of his career as an error, and in 1918 returned once more to his editorial position on Pravda. From that time onwards until 1927, he occupied a number of important party offices in the Central Committee and the Politburo. At the same time, he was one of the most important leaders of the, quote, Communist International, Comintern. In this capacity, Bukharin made a number of trips abroad and took part in drafting the program of the Third International. In 1927, Bukharin was still an undisputed authority, as may be seen from the article on Bukharin in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, but already his star was on the wane. At this time, Stalin opened his campaign for the socialization of agriculture, aimed at the abolition of private property in land and the expropriation of the larger peasants, kulaki. Bukharin was opposed to this policy. Bukharin was afraid that socialization would be harmful to agriculture and took the view that the larger peasants could also be incorporated into the socialist state by peaceful means. On this account, a violent campaign was set on foot against Bukharin and his followers, and their faction was condemned as a, quote, right-wing deviation, and, quote, Bukharin himself and Rykov were officially regarded as the ringleaders. At the plenary session of the VKPB, Moscow Committee of the CPSUB in 1928, Stalin stressed the necessity of carrying on a war on two fronts. The, quote, right-wingers were denounced as, quote, kulak agents within the party. In the years that followed, the campaign against deviations to right and to left was carried on with increasing intensity. Eventually, in 1937, both opposition parties were finally liquidated, their leaders being tried and executed. Bukharin's philosophical development was much influenced by empirio-criticism, especially of the Russian variety, and by Bogdanov's empirio-monism and techtology. Bukharin himself admits in his autobiography that for a time he was, quote, possessed of a certain heretical leaning toward the school of empirio-criticism and read everything that appeared on the subject in Russian, end quote, Bukharin. The connection with empirio-criticism can be seen in Bukharin's conception of the nature of knowledge. Avenarius had previously maintained that the task of knowledge did not consist in gaining acquaintance with things in themselves, but in building up from individual elements, i.e., sensations, a world picture, which should facilitate the struggle for existence with the minimum expenditure of energy. Hence, concepts, logical categories, and laws are nothing but a means of forming a world picture in accordance with the principle of maximum economy. Bukharin rejects this theory of empiriocriticism, but the grounds of Bukharin's dissent indicate that Bukharin had not entirely escaped its influence. Bukharin objects to exponents of the theory that they underestimate the qualitative difference which obtains between the product of cognitive activity and its sensory, raw material. Just as a locomotive is qualitatively different from the locomotive's metallic components, although it is, constructed, out of them, Bukharin. Bukharin seeks to maintain the distinction between the, product of cognitive activity and, concepts, general laws, and the sensory elements of this knowledge, sensations. But his kinship with empiriocriticism shows itself in this, that he appears to derive the whole process of knowledge from the combination of sensations, and assumes that it is man himself who constructs his world from the chaotic mass of sensory elements. Science, according to this view, is concerned not with discovering general laws from among isolated facts, but merely with systematizing the products of knowledge. Science classifies, arranges, clarifies, eliminates the contradictions in the thought of men. It constructs a complete raiment of scientific ideas and theories out of fragmentary knowledge, Bukharin. In making this claim, Bukharin allies himself to empiriocriticism, and especially to Bogdanov's version of it. For in Bogdanov's techtology also, the unity of experience is not discovered beforehand, but, created by positively organized activity, Much more important than this epistemological standpoint is Bukharin's celebrated, equilibrium theory, which is so violently attacked by the Russian dialectical materialists. It derives from the mechanistic view that Bukharin takes of the dialectic. Like the mechanist in general, Bukharin takes over the term, dialectical materialism, and explicitly describes himself as a dialectical materialist. Indeed, he agrees with Lenin in defining the dialectic as, a process of movement, the basis of which is the development of internal contradictions, And the term, internal contradiction, is repeatedly employed by him. But if one looks more closely at a great difference, if one looks more closely, a great difference can be noticed between the Leninist conception and Bukharin's materialistic view. Lenin sees the heart of the dialectic in the unity of opposites, and these dialectical opposites lie where am I? I lost my spot. I don't know. I think I lost my fucking spot, of course. It derives from the mechanistic view that Bukharin takes of the dialectic. Like the mechanist in general, Bukharin takes over the term, dialectical materialism, and explicitly describes himself as a dialectical materialist. Indeed, Bukharin agrees with Lenin in defining the dialectic as, a process of movement, the basis of which is the development of internal contradictions, And the term, internal contradiction, is repeatedly employed by him. But if one looks more closely, a great difference can be noticed between the Leninist conception and Bukharin's materialistic view. Lenin sees the heart of the dialectic in the unity of opposites, and these dialectical opposites lie, moreover, in the inner nature of things and phenomena as such. Dialectic in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the nature of things as such. Lenin. Dialectic in the proper sense is the study of contradiction in the nature of things as such. Hence it follows that things in dialectical opposition do not merely negate and exclude one another, but also presuppose and confirm one another. The bourgeoisie not only negates the proletariat, but also presupposes the proletariat. For without the proletariat there can be no question of the bourgeoisie either. Bukharin and the mechanists also speak of the unity of opposites, but among such opposites they recognize only mutual negation and not mutual presupposition or confirmation. Bukharin thinks of, quote, opposites in terms of, quote, antagonism of opposing forces, end quote. Whereas for Lenin the internal unity of opposites gives rise to self-movement, samodvizheny, a genuine movement ab intra. Motion, for Bukharin, is the product of antagonisms between opposing forces. The origin of motion lies outside things. Motion is conceived of mechanically as local motion, occasioned by an impulse supervening from without. This has the further consequence that every process is thought of as conditioned by equilibrium and the disturbance thereof. According to Bukharin, every moment in the world proceeds from the operation of diverse opposing forces. If these forces did not operate on one another, the world could remain absolutely at rest. In the world, it is the quote conflict, the quote contradiction, i.e. the antagonism of forces acting in various directions, that determines the motion of the system. End quote. Bukharin. What sort of forces are intended here? They are the forces of the, quote, system and the system's, quote, environment. By, quote, system is meant anything whatever, for everything in the world consists of diverse elements, quote, any object, a stone, a living thing, a human society, etc., may be considered as a whole consisting of parts, elements related with each other. In other words, this whole may be regarded as a system, end quote. But no system of this kind exists in empty space. It is surrounded by other things which relative thereto may be termed its, quote, environment. For man, the primary environment is human society. For society, external nature. Every movement in the world may be explained in terms of a disturbance of equilibrium between these two opposing forces. Quote, the world consists of forces acting in many ways opposing each other. These forces are balanced for a moment in exceptional cases only. We then have a state of, quote, rest, end quote, i.e. their actual, quote, conflict is concealed. But if we change only one of these forces, immediately the, quote, internal contradictions, end quote, will be revealed. Equilibrium will be disturbed, and if a new equilibrium is again established, it will be on a new basis, i.e. with a new combination of forces, etc. It follows that the, quote, conflict, the, quote, contradiction, i.e. the antagonism of forces acting in various directions, determines the motion of the system, end quote. Bukharin. The process therefore runs its course from equilibrium to a state of motion resulting from the disturbance of equilibrium, and from thence to re-establishment of a new equilibrium, and so on. Quote, on the other hand, we have here also the form of this process. In the first place, the condition of equilibrium. In the second place, a disturbance of this equilibrium. In the third place, the re-establishment of equilibrium on a new basis. And then the story begins all over again. The new equilibrium is the point of departure for a new disturbance, which in turn is followed by another state of equilibrium, etc. ad infinitum. Taken all over, we are dealing with a process of motion based on the development of internal contradictions, end quote. The above applies not only to the relations between the system and the system's environment, but also to the internal structure of the system itself. Here too, motion is the product of equilibrium relations between the elements. Quote, each system consists of its component parts, elements, united with each other in one way or another. Human society consists of people, the forest of trees and bushes, the pile of stones, of the various stones, the herd of animals, of the individual animals, etc. Between them there are a number of contradictions, differences, imperfect adaptations, etc. In other words, here also there is no absolute equilibrium. If there can be, strictly speaking, no absolute equilibrium between the environment and the system, there can also be no such equilibrium between the elements of the system itself. Bukharin. But where does the disturbance of equilibrium come from? Bukharin traces it to an alteration of the relationship between system and environment. Quote, it is quite clear that the internal structure of the system, its internal equilibrium, must change together with the relation existing between the system and its environment. The latter relation is the decisive factor. For the entire situation of the system, the fundamental form of the system's motion, decline, prosperity, or stagnation, are determined by this relation only. Consequently, the internal structural equilibrium is a quantity which depends on the external equilibrium, is a, quote, function of this external equilibrium, end quote. I'm going to repeat that quote because there's the last part of that quote because it's in italics. Consequently, the internal structural equilibrium is a quantity which depends on the external equilibrium, is a, quote, function of this external equilibrium, end quote. Bukharin. The dialectical materialists very properly object to this explanation that it makes it as impossible to continue to speak of, quote, internal contradiction, end quote, as it does of the origin of motion, since the former is in fact derived from the relation of the system to its environment. Moreover, this solution offers no answer to the question as to the actual origin of motion. For if motion be ascribed to the disturbance of equilibrium between, quote, system and, quote, environment, the question still arises as to how this disturbance comes about. Mitten is correct when he observes that, if Bukharin is to remain consistent, he has no alternative but to assume some sort of supernatural power, which has ordinarily been described hitherto as the, quote, first mover, or simply as, quote, God the Creator. It is in the threefold rhythm of motion, equilibrium, disturbance, and reestablishment of equilibrium, that Bukharin discerns the true essence of the Hegelian dialectic. The merit which Bukharin claims for his conception of dialectic is that it frees the Hegelian dialectic from all mystical elements and makes it radically and consistently materialistic. Hegel, quote, called the original condition of equilibrium the thesis, the disturbance of equilibrium, the antithesis, the reestablishment of equilibrium on a new basis, the synthesis. The characteristic of motion present in all things expresses itself in this tripartite formula, or triad, he called, quote, dialectic. Bukharin. The equilibrium theory also had its effect in the sphere of historical materialism on Bukharin's sociological views. In this connection, the dialectical materialists complain of Bukharin that Bukharin derives all social contradictions, in the last resort, from the relation between system, society, and environment, nature. Historical development thereby becomes conditioned not by the internal circumstances of society, but by the operation of natural forces. Hence, his theory is also open to the objection that it is necessarily bound up with the bourgeois conception of society, which regards the capitalist order as one of, quote, harmonious cooperation between the classes, unquote, and devotes all its energies to preserving the equilibrium of capitalist society. Section 3, Axelrod, parenthesis, orthodox, and parenthesis. In the controversy between mechanists and Debornists, the mechanists were joined by a lady of high philosophical attainments. Lyubov Isaacovna Axelrod, who wrote under the pen name of Orthodox. L.I. Axelrod was born in 1868. In 1887, after the attack on Alexander III, she was obliged to emigrate to Switzerland. There, she completed her philosophical studies at the University of Berna and was awarded the Doctorate of Philosophy. About 1890, she joined the Social Democratic Party. After the amnesty of 1906, she returned to Russia, where she belonged to a number of Menshevik organizations. From 1918 onward, she stood outside the party, but occupied herself intensively with the development of Marxist theory. She died in 1946. Axelrod's... Is there a footnote? There's a footnote. Not to be confused with Paul Borisovich Axelrod, a Narodnik who emigrated to Switzerland, where he joined Plekhanov in founding the Liberation of Labor Group and later allied himself with the Mensheviks, nor with her sister, Ida Isaacovna Axelrod, who also left for Switzerland in 1893 and subsequently belonged to the Liberation of Labor Group. End footnote. Axelrod's philosophical importance rests on Axelrod's polemic against the critical Marxists at the beginning of the century. As an orthodox Marxist, she sided with Plekhanov in a highly effective defense of dialectical materialism. Her articles against various forms of neo-Kantianism, directed, among others, against Berdyaev and Struve, were published in collected form as philosophical studies. Axelrod's later essays attacking imperial criticism and Bogdanov also constituted a defense of dialectical materialism. After the Revolution, they appeared with other works in a volume entitled Against Idealism. She also published after the Revolution a collection of studies titled Marx as a Philosopher, and a work devoted to historical materialism, Critique of the Foundations of Bourgeois Society and Historical Materialism. The pamphlet titled In Defense of Dialectical Materialism Against Scholasticism belongs to the period of controversy between mechanists and Debornists. After the official condemnation of mechanism and Menshevizing idealism, she published a further pamphlet titled The Idealist Dialectic of Hegel and the Materialist Dialectic of Marx, which stands out favorably for its penetrating account of the Hegelian system above many of the Soviet philosophical publications of the period. Axelrod was an energetic opponent of the critical Marxists and their war cry titled... Axelrod was an energetic opponent of the critical Marxists and their war cry back to Kant, as if Marxism possessed no theory of knowledge its own. Axelrod accused them of confounding the critical theory of knowledge with epistemology in general, and pointed out that the latter was older than Kant, and that many materialist systems of the 18th century had already possessed a theory of knowledge. All the more true is this of Marxist materialism, which is not metaphysical but dialectical. Dialectical materialism, moreover, is by nature epistemological in character, since dialectical materialism acknowledges neither a closed metaphysical system nor fixed metaphysical substances. End quote. Axelrod. It is precisely in this metaphysical concept of knowledge that Axelrod sees the common failing of all the endeavors of modern philosophy, a conception which views all things as fixed, stable, isolated substances. The starting point is given rise to the problem of knowledge and to a metaphysical interpretation of subject and object in the knowing process as separate substances. It is the same mistake as that already found in Locke. Quote, he fails to conceive of our knowledge as a continuous, uninterrupted process of development, in which consciousness has no function apart from the perception of external objects of experience, and hence cannot be divorced from them. Locke thinks of consciousness rather as a form independent of the of the effect exerted by the object. Quote, Axelrod. Consciousness divorced from the object of knowledge encounters in sensation a boundary, a limit. Quote, Between the object and consciousness, sensation stands therefore as an impassable barrier. The result is that the influence of the object on our senses, instead of putting us in touch with it, cuts us off from it." End quote. In consequence of this metaphysical method, Berkeley and Hume arrived at a total denial of the objective world. Kant's critical philosophy. Is that true of Hume? I mean, I know Berkeley was like an idealist, but I don't know if that's true of Hume. Kant's critical philosophy, which endeavored to reinstate the objective world and to provide a basis for the theory of scientific experience, suffers from the same Lockean defect. Here, too, owing to the contradictory conception of the, quote, thing in itself, the influence of the object on the subject not only fails to effect any union between them, but sets up a severance of principle which makes the, quote, thing in itself, and, quote, unknowable. These metaphysicians, in Axelrod's opinion, have mistakenly isolated the thing from the knowing subject because they looked at knowledge from a metaphysical, not a historical point of view. Marx's dialectical materialism avoids this mistake. For dialectical materialism, all knowledge derives from experience and is therefore knowledge a posteriori. The possibility of a priori knowledge is emphatically rejected. It does not follow from this, however, that knowledge has no necessary or universal characteristics. It is a metaphysical prejudice that a priori knowledge alone has necessary and universal validity. Quote, "Truth acquired by way of experience is universally binding, real, indubitable, and retains its full objective significance, so long as it does not itself contradict experience. A law inferred a posteriori, this serves therefore as an a priori guiding principle, so long as it is not confuted by practical reality." End quote. Axelrod. And here Axelrod appeals to the authority of Marx, who considered the question whether human knowledge could encompass reality to be not a theoretical but a practical one, since it finds its solution in practice. And Axelrod continues, quote, "Our capacity for bringing about changes in the state of the object, our ability to shape the material order in accordance with their purposes, and to predict phenomena and their mutual relationships, all this is a sufficient guarantee of the fact that material nature really exists, and that we are acquainted with material nature's characteristics." End quote. For the same reason as those she advances against Locke and Kant, namely to prevent subject and object being separated in the knowing process by sensation, Axelrod adheres to Plekhanov's hieroglyphic theory and criticizes the Leninist copy theory from this point of view. In Lenin's conception, she sees an inverted Platonism, a dualism at variance with the materialist philosophy, which proceeds from a monistic principle. If sensations are copies of things, then the things themselves are rendered superfluous and become genuine examples of things in themselves, as they do in Kant. But this is to open up an unbridgeable gulf between subject and object. Plekhanov's hieroglyphic theory avoids this pitfall. Quote, "The symbolic theory, which asserts the existence of both subject and object, unifies these two factors by treating the subject as a special sort of object and its sensations as a product of the interaction between two objects, of which one is at the same time the subject." Okay. Hence, entirely in the spirit of the hieroglyphic theory, she concludes, quote, "But materialism adheres to the view that the sensations called forth by the operation of the various forms of motion and matter do not resemble the objective processes which give rise to them." End quote. Axelrod. The Leninist dialectical materialists maintain that Axelrod has failed to grasp that in the copy theory, the relation between subject and object is a dialectical relation, and that subject and object are thereby united, whereas in Axelrod's view, As in that of Kant, quote, knowledge does not unite. Knowledge brings man closer to nature, but simply disintegrates them both, end quote. M.B. Mitten. In the controversy between mechanism and Debornism, Lyubov Axelrod took the mechanist side and was vehemently attacked by Deborin on that account. Footnote: among other places, in Deborin's concluding speech to the conference of the Institute of Scientific Philosophy on the 18th of May, 1925, reprinted under the title Our Differences. End footnote. Deborin objected to Lyubov that she denied not only the category of quality, but the dialectic itself, turning it into a mere form of representation of scientific data, whereas in fact it must also be regarded as a science of the laws and objective forms of motion. In general, he accuses her of defending mechanistic materialism. Deborin. Since most of the discussions between mechanists and Deborinists have not been made available to us in detail, we have unfortunately no means of deciding how far Axelrod carried her mechanistic views. Mitten also numbers her among the mechanists. If he is right in doing so, she too must have altered her position after the suppression of mechanism in the USSR. In her pamphlet titled The Idealist Dialectic of Hegel and the Materialist Dialectic of Marx, she adheres on all the main issues in dispute to the viewpoint of orthodox dialectical materialism. Thus she now sees dialectic as a science of motion and reality itself. Hegel's dialectic is described as, quote, formal, since, quote, all transitions and distinctions, all forms of contradiction in the world process, were elaborated down to the last detail by him, quote, within a framework of speculation, end quote, so that these distinctions, being represented as distinctions within substance itself, bear no relation to the distinction between real things as such, end quote. Axelrod. Dialectical materialism, on the other hand, when it employs the dialectic as a method of inquiry, requires that the dialectical movement shall also be disclosed in the object under investigation itself. Axelrod also assumes here that this dialectical movement gives rise to new qualities in the world, quote, new orders in which the elements of the given order represent something more complex, something higher in comparison with previous orders, something constituting a new quality which cannot be immediately traced back to the original elements of the starting point. End quote. Axelrod. And that's the end of Chapter 7 of Dialectical Materialism, a historical and systematic survey by Gustav A. Vetter.